It all started when the Jenkins family moved in next door to Mr. Carl Johnson. The Jenkins were a white family of 5, parents Doug and Susan and their 3 kids, Haley, aged 12, Evan, 9, and the baby Ella. Carl, a retired mechanic and lifelong bachelor, was a black man in his late 60s, with a laugh that could shake the walls and a collection of vinyl records he treated like treasure. From the outset, their differences were apparent. The Jenkins had a perfectly manicured lawn, their golden retriever, Max, bounding happily in the backyard. Carl, on the other hand, had a garden that was slightly overgrown but bursting with life, collard greens, okra and tomatoes sprouting in uneven rows. The first time their paths crossed, it was over the smell of food. Carl was grilling ribs in his backyard, seasoning so heavily that the aroma wafted over the fence. Doug, trimming his hedges, couldn't help but comment. "That smells amazing, Mr. Johnson," Doug said, wiping sweat from his brow. "You must really love barbecue." Carl grinned. "A man's got to know how to season his meat. You cook much, or you just eat what the box tells you to microwave?" Doug chuckled nervously, unsure if Carl was teasing or serious. "We do our best. Susan makes a mean casserole." "Casserole?" Carl raised an eyebrow. "You got to explain that one to me sometime." A week later, the Jenkins invited Carl over for dinner. Carl hesitated at first, not used to stepping into other people's homes, but Susan insisted. Their dining table was covered in dishes that were, to Carl, utterly foreign. A tuna noodle casserole, green bean salad, and a plate of deviled eggs. Carl tried to keep an open mind, but couldn't help commenting. "You really don't use spices, huh?" he asked after his first bite. Susan laughed, though a bit nervously. "We like to keep it simple, healthy." "Healthy, huh? That why you boiled the flavour out of those green beans?" Haley giggled, and Doug shot her a look. The tables turned when Carl invited the Jenkins over the following Sunday. Carl's home smelled rich and warm, like smoked meat and fried everything. He served ribs, collard greens, cornbread and mac and cheese that oozed cheese from every corner. Haley's eyes lit up. "This is so good!" she exclaimed after her first bite of cornbread. "Why don't we ever make food like this?" "Because your dad would have a heart attack," Susan muttered, though she couldn't deny the food was delicious. Evan, licking barbecue sauce off his fingers, looked at Carl and asked, "Why don't you eat casseroles?" Carl chuckled. "Because I like my food to taste like food, kid. No offense." Doug couldn't hold back anymore. "Carl, I gotta ask, do you really think our food is that bad?" Carl leaned back, wiping his hands on a napkin. "Nah, man, it's not bad, it's just different. You grow up eating what your mama puts on the table, and that sticks with you. My mama didn't make casseroles, she made ribs, and she made me learn how to make them too. Guess it's just how I was raised." Doug nodded, thinking about his own childhood. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes on Mondays, spaghetti on Thursdays, comfort food the way his mom had always made it. As the night went on, they talked about more than food. They talked about Carl's years working in a shop, about how different the neighborhood looked back in the day. Susan shared stories of moving around as a military kid, never staying in one place for long. By the time the Jenkins left, Haley declared Carl's ribs the best thing she'd ever eaten, and Doug promised to try seasoning his chicken with something other than just salt and pepper. Over time, the fence between their yards felt less like a barrier and more like a line they crossed regularly. Carl would bring over plates of food when he made too much, and Susan started experimenting with spicier recipes, always asking for Carl's advice. Their lives were still different. The Jenkins liked game nights and soccer practice, while Carl spent his time tending his garden or playing his records. But the more they shared meals and stories, the more they realized how much they had in common. They laughed at the same jokes, worried about the same bills, and cared deeply for the people around them. And in the end, the food became a metaphor for everything else. Different flavors, different styles, but all meant to nourish and bring people together.